My name is Gregory Holson with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and I want to welcome you today to the PHRC's Correcting the Pipeline, Conscious Approaches to the Vulnerable Populations. Within this virtual conference, we hope to explore the way to correct the school-to-prison pipeline and address the ongoing challenges that comes within it. But before we get into this thought-provoking topic, I want to introduce to you the Executive Director of the PHRC. Chad Dion Lasser is a national expert in the field of American race relations. Mr. Lasser has worked on race, peace, and poverty-related issues in the United States and within many countries around the world. In April of 2023, Mr. Lasser was appointed by President Biden to the Presidential Advisory Commission on Advancing Educational Equity, Excellence, and Economic Opportunities for Black Americans. Director Lasser is a forerunner in the spaces of DEI training, unconscious bias training, and anti-racism training. Please help me welcome Chad Dion Lasser. Edie, the floor is yours, sir.
Good morning. Thank you, Gregory. Welcome, everyone, to this beloved community, this virtual space for what is the third display of the School to Prison Pipeline Conference. We're giving birth to just a new way of looking at how we correct the pipeline. Some people frame it out as community to school to prison, but nevertheless, we have some really robust presentations prepared for today. Want to always just humble ourselves and thank ASL for being here. For ASL is not just a discipline, it is certainly a calling. So we're happy to have our ASL individuals here. Kudos to the planning committee who put this together. And once again, we want to thank everyone for being here this morning. I always say this when we're doing something in the virtual space, put on either your real seatbelts or your metaphoric seatbelts, because the lineup that we have is a lineup that will actually educate you, reinforce some things that you know, but also inspire you to a call of action. So once again, welcome to this third edition of School to Prison Pipeline. Thank you to the Planning Committee. Thank you to the Director of Communications. And thank you for everyone being here and looking forward to a wonderful conference. Thank you, Gregory.
Thank you, Edie Lasser. Now, we'll have a special presentation from the Vice Chair of the PHRC Commissioners, Dr. Raquel Yanks, as she explores the historical context of the disparity gaps within our educational system. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank Commissioner Yanks for sitting with me this afternoon to help us understand the historical context to the school to prison pipeline. I would be remiss if I did not intro with a little bit of her background before the questions start. She served as the Director of Bilingual Education, serving the Reading School District for 37 years. She's currently in her role as Vice Chair of the Commission for Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission and has served in this role for 44 years. So I'm excited to ask you the questions that we have so that you can give us, again, the historical context and help us learn where we are at today and what routes we can take in the future to improve the process. What trends did you see throughout your career that still exist today?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Cheryl, for giving me the opportunity to sit here with you and talk about a subject that is so dear and near to my heart, and for which I have a great deal of passion, which is education. I have been an educator all my life, and that's the role that I have enjoyed the most ever. I am by no means an expert on education. However, I have some experiences that have led me to realize how important education is in my early years, and also to realize that education is the only way for some of our people for upward mobility. When I came to the Reading School District, there were 400 Latino children in the Reading School District, and many of them were in special education because they had been tested by an English-speaking psychologist with an English-speaking test. And when I saw those children sitting there in special education, it broke my heart, number one. Number two, it took me back to my days as a student when my parents sent me to the United States to college, and I was a freshman in college and a non-English speaker. So I saw in their faces myself all over again. And I started to ask questions. I was young and I was fearless. And so I didn't care whether I had a job or whether they had fired me or not. And so I started to ask some questions that they really didn't have answers for. And they were very difficult questions. First question that I asked was, why are these children here? And when they told me what happened, I just couldn't believe it. And I was bracing enough to say to the superintendent, well, I guess if I give you a test in Spanish, you will fail also. And he looked at me and like, how dare you talk to me like that? But, I just wanted him to realize that uh, anybody, no matter whether they're young or old, if you are treating them or teaching them in an English that is not your own, they're not going to be able to perform.
Do you think that those barriers still exist today?
Whether it still exists or not, my answer would be take a look at the dropout rate, and then you tell me if those conditions still exist.
Yeah.
So our students are dropping out like flies. There's no doubt about it. One of the things that I think when you put all children in a classroom, sitting in regular class, and sitting there, and the teacher in the front teaching, a teacher is going to teach to the middle, and the very bright will get it, the middle will get it, and the ones on the left are left behind. Uh, so what I did when I created the bilingual program in Reading was that I started with individualized and small group instruction. My bilingual classrooms were not like a regular classroom when you walk in. You had children sitting in a group here and in a group here and a group here, because when these children come from the different countries, each child is totally different. You cannot put them together, because I could have a student that came from Mexico at age 10 that had never been in school.
Right.
So where do you place them? You're not going to place them in kindergarten. You have to place them in fourth grade. And if you're going to teach fourth grade, ridiculous to even think about it. The other thing that I think is extremely important, and I saw declining over the years, was the parental involvement. Yes. I did my doctoral dissertation in parental involvement. And parental involvement is very important to me because, that's where everything begins, at home. And, I get very sad every time I am having a discussion or a training and people always say it's the parents' fault. We are always pointing to the wrong person. We need to know where those parents come from and what their educational level is and what their culture is before we can say it's the parents' fault. I'm going to give you an example. In the Hispanic culture, the school is the second home and the teacher is the second mother. And when the parents send their children to school, they feel they are totally protected and that everything in that school is doing everything for their child. But what I saw was that a regular classroom did not fit the needs of the students.
And I think that that's a major takeaway from this conversation with you, is that it's important to look at each child and meet their needs equitably. And as you said, if a 10-year-old came here with Spanish speaking as his primary language, and he's put into a classroom of his peers, we're already doing that child a disservice by not providing him the resources that he needs. What approaches should be taken that are currently not being done to assist students that are impacted by the pipeline?
Yes, children need to be punished. Children need to know that they did wrong and that every wrongdoing has a consequence. But let's do it in a way that it does not interrupt their education. So in-school suspension, I think that's a good thing. If they go to a room where they have a teacher and they have to bring their homework and do their homework, and that teacher is, working with them as he or were the classroom teacher. So school suspension out there in the street, it's a ticket to pipeline.
So
in
I love
education.
this, suggestion made by you then, that the school perhaps could collectively look at their disciplinary measures and
Correct.
instead of sending students out of the building, keep them in, but with a different kind of structure. So it's, yes, to a degree, a punishment if appropriately called for, but we're also keeping the student in a safe environment and providing them the resources that equitably meet their needs.
And I also think, that if you take those children and put it in another class with another teacher and following the assignments and the curriculum of their regular class, that also is kind of an embarrassment, and they might want to return to the classroom and act differently. Because, children want to be with their peers. They don't want to be over there where everybody knows, oh, look, he's over in that class, he's not sitting here with us.
Yeah, well, thank you for your time this afternoon. It's been a pleasure asking you these questions and learning what the educational system was like throughout the years and where we are today, and hearing about that one group that separated the students by need and meeting them where they're at. It sounds like that is going to be one of the most profound ways that we can help our children today.
Absolutely.
Let's open it up to the floor now for questions. Thank you, Commissioner Yanks.
So unfortunately, Commissioner Yanks was unable to join us for the conference, or at least this morning half. We're hoping that she can join us later in the day. So we will forego the question and answer period for her. I want to turn it back over to Greg, but before I do, listening to Commissioner Yanks, what came to mind was not only the Latino students, but seeing other countries around the world that are under pressure, right, and are conflicted with war at the moment. And so we're seeing an influx of families, including their children and students, coming to the United States seeking asylum, and they too are not English speaking. And so while I think it's been more prevalent in Commissioner Yanks' experience with regards to Latino students, with today's climate and where the world is, we have to be mindful that it's not only Latino, but any non-English speaking student, and being mindful of those cultural differences within each respective student's, background. So I really appreciate Commissioner Yanks' input. I'm sure everyone else appreciates that historical construct, and I want to turn it back over to Greg.
Thank you, Director Chang. And anytime I hear Dr. Yanks, she is just a wellspring of knowledge and really always provides that historical perspective through her lived experience through the educational system. And it's always good to hear from her. But now we'll be watching a video that displays some interactions that we've been talking about when it comes to students and resource officers. And it's going to display some things that might be triggering. But we have this video because we want to seek change. We want to display to you what we're looking at and what we're seeking to move forward from. Just beware that this video has some sensitive content.
Oh, the video is heavy. Uh, as a parent, several of those images are incredibly hard to view. For myself, as a parent of a Black boy, the images are gut wrenching. I'm sure many others share in my sentiments. And while I understand and our committee understands that it's incredibly difficult to watch, it's necessary. It's necessary to fully understand the gravity of the school to prison pipeline. Our children are being criminalized at incredibly tender ages. But before we jump in to the remarkable experts that are featured today, we wanted to give everyone a moment to just breathe, reset, and settle the emotions that the video may have stirred up. So if I can ask you all to indulge me for the next moment or two, we want to engage in a 4-7-8 mindful breathing exercise. So on my prompts, we're going to settle in, get comfortable in your space, and I'm going to walk us through it, and it's also here on the screen as well. So we're going to breathe in for a count of 4, we're going to hold for a count of 7, and we're going to breathe out for a count of 8. And we're going to do 2 rounds of that. So we're going to start. Breathe in, hold, breathe out. One more time. Breathe in, hold, breathe out. Okay, go back to our normal breathing pattern. And I thank you for allowing this space to be just a little bit safer. And please continue to use this method throughout the conference if you feel triggered in any way or unsettled with any of the content that our experts are going to provide to us. Now, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Venus L. Ricks. Venus is an equity and inclusion strategist whose experience crosses a number of sectors, including higher education, workforce development, psychological research, state and local government, and the nonprofit sector. Her work centers on justice-minded excellence, where human-centered leadership, equity, and trauma-informed public service intersect to create work and community spaces that deconstruct oppression and allow human bodies to thrive. So without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce Venus L. Ricks to educate us on the foundations of the pipeline. Venus?
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are.
Good, good, good. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I just want to, before I get started, say I really enjoy when I don't have to introduce myself. So thank you all for that. I also not enjoy actually doing presentations this early. I only do them for people I really enjoy. So thank you to the committee and to the PHRC for having me this morning. And I look forward to this, and I hope that I can leave you with some seeds and understanding and some knowledge to take with you out into the professional worlds and personal worlds that you live every day. Thank you for that fabulous introduction. And now, I have to share screen, but it's telling me only meeting organizers can share.
We'll have our director of communications rectify that immediately.
Okay.
Yes, I'm working on it.
Well, as they're working, not that we have to fill time, because I believe that silence is a great kind of reset moment. So I know that as I'll talk about some things in the presentation, I even am unlearning some stuff that I've taken in from the culture, right? Socialize and things like that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But
Should
this
be
morning,
good now. Sorry.
all good? Okay, so I can stop stalling my chat, my
I
ramble.
believe you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, great. Is it going to make me leave and come back in? Let's see. Nope, still not letting me do it. Hold on. Dun, dun, dun.
While you're doing that, I just wanted to, I've seen the video for the audience members. I've seen the compilation video that we just shared many times through the planning process. And the images are hard, but the statistics, I hope you all had the opportunity to read the statistics on the screen as well. And again, I want to defer you back to the beginning of the chat. We did provide the digital program, and within that digital program is a toolkit that includes some of those statistics as well as some other facts, the expungement process, and just some additional resources provided by our experts, as well as some other content that we found very valuable through our planning process, because those statistics are just staggering. We know that the three most prominent populations, vulnerable populations, when we're talking about the students, are students with mental health, students in Black and brown bodies, and students that are impoverished. And so that's our community, that's our commonwealth. And so, we have to be mindful. I share often in trainings, more recently when the school to prison pipeline or a student body comes up, or educators more specifically is the audience, that we have school districts within our commonwealth right now that has 100% student population that falls into that vulnerable population, 100% of their student body. And so this is very real. It's very close to home. And so it's an incredibly important conversation. Yes, Venus, we're good?
It is still not letting me share.
Do you
So
want
would you
to
like
send
me
it
to
to
send?
me?
Yes, I was going to say, would you like me to send
Sure.
the slides to you? I'll do that right
Absolutely.
now.
And we are ahead of schedule a bit, so
Venus, if you want to try, I'm sorry, one more time, because it just gave me the option to make you a presenter. That option was not, so I don't know if maybe
You
now.
were fancy. It worked this time. Woo, woo, woo.
Great.
And as Desiree said, we are ahead of schedule. So let me get this going.
There we go.
Got it? Okay, now, Teams is always a little bit of a task for me. So I'm not necessarily looking at you all right now. You can see me, but I'm seeing the presentation. Good stuff?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you again for having me. My part of the presentation to intro you into the other two presenters is on the implicit foundations of the pipeline. So not necessarily giving you a ton of statistics, but really just talking about what is happening with the humans today that is actually replicating certain cultures that are allowing for young people to be put into a pipeline as early as elementary and some preschool, right? So we even see it now, even going back into preschool. And so what is creating some of these vulnerable situations? How are folks managing that, right? Both in their bodies and in navigating the school system. We know there are a number of institutions that we interface with every single day, whether that's education, whether that's our work environments, right, out in the community. And everyone has taken in different things about how we're supposed to behave, what we understand as rules and roles, and what are the characteristics of our society. And so we'll talk a little bit about that and how that mindset, right, our minds are what is making us behave or make decisions that aren't in the best interest for young people or our health outcomes, right, particularly for those who are minoritized in our country and in our state. I always like to start any presentation with an acknowledgement of the humans that had this land or lived on this land prior to myself. And so right now where I'm located, I'm situated on unceded land of the Lenape people and recognize their status as first people of this land and the colonial policies, practices, and laws that killed and pushed the Lenape people out of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania opened the first government-run forced assimilation boarding school for Native Americans in 1879. Operating for 39 years, the school closed in 1918. As a result of the inhumane treatment, over 180 Indigenous children lost their lives at the school. A common refrain by its founder, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Pennsylvania is one of a few states that neither has a reservation, nor officially recognizes any First Nations within its borders. And so as you think about the school to prison pipeline, we can think about these early experiences of humans of color, right? Of racial minoritization, where folks were put into places where they were made to be a problem to solve, not folks to embrace and share their culture with. And so how are some of these historical moments, some of these historical pieces, whether they are laws or otherwise, informing how we practice and how we understand humanity today? Additionally, I'd like to acknowledge that it's Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and understanding that Asia is a huge continent made of many countries, regions, skin tones, languages, customs, and traditions, and that the Asian identity is a part of a large diaspora, understanding that it's a group of people who may share a national or regional origin, but for a variety of reasons may not be living in that homeland currently. And so just thinking about that as we think about Black and brown bodies, as we think of bodies of color and how they navigate American systems, particularly United States systems. So years back, I read a book by Melissa Harris Perry that talks about crooked images. And she shared that there is psychological research out there that was done with soldiers, particularly prisoners of war. And they put these folks in a room with a number of images. And so what they were asking the soldiers to do is find your upright in comparison to the images reflecting back at you. And if you were someone in the room that found your upright, which means you're balanced, you're straight up and down, regardless of how tilted or distorted the images were reflecting back at you, you were found to be independent of that environment. So you could find your center, your upright, who you were, regardless of what that image was reflecting back at you. But those who contorted their bodies and did things right and moved and tried to find their upright based off of the tilt of the images were found to be dependent on the environment, right? And so what they were doing were contorting their bodies, changing themselves, trying to fit into something, right, that was not connected to their up and down. And what I connect this to is the experience that we are all having, whether we are in a minoritized body or not, or in a majoritized body, that white supremacy, both as a system and then as a culture, has really dictated how we interact with one another, how we behave, our belief structures, and much of those beliefs and behaviors are rooted in systems of exclusion, right? And we understand that white supremacy as a system is historically based and it's institutionally perpetuated. It happened across the globe. And it's about establishing and maintaining as well as defending, right? So keep that in mind, defending a system of wealth, power, and access. And we know access as typically folks are talking about privilege. And so as we think about dominance, right, we think about power, social power, gender, race, and class are the three social identity components, the three power structures that really inform white supremacy as a system. And that is what, right? Gender dominance, race dominance, and class dominance is what we have learned and have been socialized to defend and protect, okay? As a culture, we've developed an ideology that white people and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions are superior to those of color. And understanding that currently, we are looking at in the US, by 2045, we will be a racially minoritized majority. And if we understand that the global majority, it are folks of color, because we make up 80% of this population. And so as the United States has grown and continues to evolve and grow in global populations, we have to understand this supremacy and how it informs our culture. And so how do we get this culture? It's reinforced through socialization, right? Depending on how you were born or where you were born into a family, those who took care of you, and you get your first socialization. This is either congruent or incongruent with the institutional and cultural socialization, right? This is the mechanism upon which we understand our superiority or inferiority in this country. And this is not to say that people are as just being born, right, superior and inferior. It means that you're being born into a system and a culture that has determined before you even get here whether you are to be treated in a superior way or you should be treated in an inferior way. And this is rooted in the system of enslavement. And so as you get outside of that first socialization, whatever it is that you learn at the home, as I said, whether it's home or the people that cared for you, You start to develop and understand what social and cultural values mean to you. And then you go out into that, again, that first socialization and start to learn about culture, what rules and roles you have to abide by, the appropriate and acceptable behavior. It's a reward and punishment structure. We learn things we get reinforced through media, we get reinforced through institutions like education, primarily education, right? Because the curriculum is rooted in showcasing not what folks of color have experienced in this country, but otherwise, right? What the majority experiences. Those things that people of color have experienced are being left out and pushed far outside of the margins. And it's kind of, if you choose to educate yourself, choose to engage in that information, is where you can get that. This is passed from generation to generation, right? Some folks pass on inferiority because it's survival. It's how you are moving about and what you know, right? While others are passing on you're superior. And so these are implicit ways that this is happening, right? Folks aren't sitting there saying, I'm inferior to so-and-so, so now I must behave this way. These are the ways our brains have adjusted and evolved due to this structure and this system. And so what you have at the center of socialization that keeps it going is fear, insecurity, ignorance, and then the reflexive responses embedded in the body, particularly the central nervous system. And so we have responses, right, on various levels to racism. And right now, because we are dealing with institutional, structural, interpersonal, and internalized racism, it feels like a pressure cooker, right? Because if you think about the school system's functioning under a structure and it's an institution. And then you have the folks that are practicing the institution and the structure within the school. So between people, interpersonal, right? This could be teachers, this could be administrators, this could be between the teachers and the students, between students and other students. And then you have the internalized pieces, right? Folks either internalize the inferiority or they internalize the superiority. And then they practice that, how they interact with other people. So thinking of this, we have to understand what scaffolds it, what keeps it going, besides the humans, right? And the mindset that in order to be successful in this country, in order to make it, you must fit in to these narrow ways of operating. And our laws and policies in this country have scaffolded the ways in which certain bodies are excluded out of the areas that give them most access and more health outcomes. If you think of this as a health need, right? We understand that the education system, the healthcare system, our communities and our neighborhoods, our social and community context, and our economic stability. In all of these areas, bodies of color are not faring well. There are not equitable ways in which people are faring. And much of that is due to implicit bias, right? We believe in what we've been taught about how bodies of color should navigate, right? That they are bodies that are to be policed, bodies that are to be surveilled, bodies that are always looking for trouble, right? And if in our minds, we see particularly young Black men, young Hispanic men as problems, and also, right, adultification of young Black girls, we understand that this is in the mind. Because if we know that by 2045, the majority will be minoritized, how are we still practicing a system that in numbers is not real? So I do want to take a moment to just show you this video. I like to kind of, my colleagues role modeled very well. There will be some probably triggering moments. It's a 4-minute video, it's not long. So please just kind of take care of yourself. If there's anything that sparks up emotion, that's okay. Take some time to jot whatever you have down. Use the chat feature if you need to. Good morning. How are you? Cool. So, can we talk about how you got here?
Hey, you think I got a funny looking face?
Hey kids, I'm telling you, go right here.
Man, we ain't doing nothing.
Go right here before I'm called cops.
So, you didn't do anything?
Nope.
Then what's all this?
Depends on who's reading it, I guess.
Well, looks broken. Skateboarding, huh?
Yes.
Is this the first time you've hurt yourself?
No, I get hurt all the time.
At home?
At home? He hurt himself skateboarding at the park.
Okay, ma'am. I'm going to have a counselor come in and speak with you.
A counselor? For what? He's okay.
Well, I done told you them tricks were gonna put you in the hospital.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, too. A nurse will be in a few minutes to help you check out.
What's up?
That doctor thought I did this to him.
How you doing?
Hi.
It ain't fair.
Fair has nothing to do with this. This is about you taking responsibility for your actions. Look, I know so many young men just like you that didn't do anything. And yet, most of them are in prison.
You don't know me. I ain't going to no prison.
If you don't want to end up in prison, you're going to have to get some new priorities and probably some new friends too. Look, you're not getting any younger. You need to get an education so you can get a good job.
Like you just like everybody else. You think you see, but you don't see. You see what you want to see.
I see what's in this folder. It shows me what you've been doing.
I ain't doing nothing.
I am not doing anything. Stop.
I ain't doing nothing.
I'm not doing anything. And yes, you were. Get to the timeout chair. Now, please. I'm sorry. I am so sorry.
So implicit bias, it's the way that we set up automatic responses, right? We don't set them up, our body does it. And as we learn how to keep ourselves safe, right? Our body automatically responds to that. So our body thinks, I said body several times, I'm sorry. It thinks that by adjusting to a structure, to this institution, to this socialization, that it will keep you safe. If you are on the side of, right, being socialized that whiteness is of danger to you because of the ways that you've experienced racism, right? And then on the other side, the dominance piece, right? I should be expected to, I should be able to, right? And then how we go into institutions and practice these things repeatedly. And so there are characteristics that come with white supremacy culture that seep into how we teach, how we lead, how we make decisions, how we behave, right? Because if in these environments, in these structures, we do it well, quote unquote, we will be rewarded. If you don't do it well, you're punished. And so if you are someone who culturally does not align with white supremacy standards or that cultural right, that culture, this is a complicated tension, right? You're always being told to go back into a box, always told to go back into something where you're aligning with crooked images. Those images don't align with you, and the society has not decided or has not understood that in order for these bodies to be successful and not funneled into the prison system, you have to look at behavior in a different way. You have to look at how you're addressing young people in a different way. You have to interrogate your biases, where you learn these things. Are you culturally competent and aware of how your participation in white supremacy culture is now shoving a young person out of the environment? And all this culture does, all this structure does, is push Black and brown bodies out of these institutions. And today we're talking about education. So they're pushing them out of the schools, right? Pushing them into other things versus how do we create practices and training or counseling for teachers around doing this work, not just teachers, but administrators, those folks that are making decisions for how curriculum goes, for how what should be learned and not learned. And so if you come from a culture that is more collective and you are constantly being shoved into an individualism environment, what does that do for you? It does something internally, right? It makes it pushes your nervous system. We know that the things above the line here, right, the overt white supremacy, are not socially acceptable, but yet we will embrace or we'll be okay with, we won't interrupt the things that happen underneath, right? And this is where the stuff underneath is what is causing young folks of color to have the experience that they're having in the educational system, right? We're relying heavily on stereotypes. Oh, I'm not. I shouldn't say we. I should say societally, right? Black and brown youth. These zero tolerance policies. When you have so much mental health and stress around racism, having zero tolerance policies is just tone deaf, right? Classifying minority students as beyond help or lost causes. If you understand, right, that trauma, if you understand that stress can be passed on, right? You can experience stress from others, even if it's not your own stress. So think about parents of color, particularly if you're of color and you're grappling with economic insecurity, which a disproportionate number of Black and brown people are. Black and brown youth are viewed as something to handle, as if they're adults as well. And so how are we doing this in a different way? How are we understanding what we've learned and unlearning that so we can serve publicly as teachers, as administrators, as public servants in a different way? How are we looking at habits of harm and the ways in which they are invisible, excuse me, I'm getting excited, invisible barriers to achievement? So what is a habit? A settled or regular tendency or practice, especially one that is hard to give up. Harm, damage the health of, to have an adverse effect on. And so how in the school system and other institutions in our country, macroaggressions, right? The big systemic forms of oppression rather than interpersonal forms of bias or discrimination. This is something, right? The education system has become a big systemic form of oppression. We're talking about getting it right, CRT, which doesn't belong at K-12, but that's another presentation for another day. Microaggressions, right? The everyday experiences that these bodies are having in the school, right? Not being heard, not being understood, their language being a problem if you speak another language, or even if you're, as you saw in the previous video, correcting the young man's language, because it's not the way you speak doesn't mean that it's wrong. And so how are we showing young people or relating messages that say you're not going to achieve because you don't fit into this box and you won't get shoved into the box? Race-based chronic stress and trauma. Trauma pushes the activation of the nervous system beyond its ability to self-regulate. As a result, it can become stuck on, and it's consistently in survival mode. So when we're thinking about what's happening with racism and chronic stress, if we know racial trauma to be chronic, prolonged, and passed from generation to generation, young people are being protected from something, right? being told that you can't trust this structure, you can't trust this system. And it's reinforced when you go to school. It's reinforced when you engage with the health system, right? And trauma is not just an event. It's your body's response to an event, the protective response. So when you've learned that I have to protect myself from, whether it's a body of color or otherwise, your body will respond in a way, right? Or dodge it because it's a trauma response. And so all of this is about eradicating racism. When we're talking about eradicating racism, we're also talking about how are we eradicating it from our bodies, right? Because that's what's getting us to keep things moving and continuing to grow. The impact of racism on child behavior. This isn't just child behavior, right? If you understand, right, dysregulation, if we're talking about folks being pushed outside of their central nervous system, how are folks showing up dysregulated? And they're not the problem. The environment that they're brewing in, right, that they're stewing in is the problem. How do we shift these environments? Because as you saw earlier, social determinants of health. If all of those environments in some way you are experiencing institutional, structural, individual, and internalized racism, that is going to impact your body in a way that is not conducive to you learning, not conducive to you interacting with your peers and or authority figures. Not saying that you don't know how to respect authority or listen to authority, but it's going to impact the interactions, right? How you trust the environment because it's showing you and it's reinforcing all of what you were told about it. How do we hurt less and affirm more, right? I like to tell myself that in the head. Am I hurting or am I affirming, right? It really doesn't matter what society has told us about humans. What do we want to learn about those humans and their experience in your classroom, outside of the classroom, wherever they are? Prioritizing disrupting bias, habits of harm, and power-centered exclusion. Acknowledging and addressing implicit ways of thinking and behaving in the culture. Fostering cultures where minoritized bodies experience less inferiority than they might in the broader world. And we hear things like, well, we don't have enough time. Time is what you make it. Time is what you are pushing past. And as you see, right, quick, being fast, that's part of the white supremacy culture. And other cultures don't navigate that way, right? There are other cultures that take their time. It's more about being thoughtful and how we're treating one another. Kindness. We speak kindness, but we don't do kindness. How are schools intentionally working to, like I said, hurt less and affirm more in all of their work, whether it's policy, practice, cultural development, right? The impact is how minoritized bodies experience school, how they learn, how they connect to the school and the teachers and the administrators. It improves psychological safety. It helps to have engagement and contribution, not just from the students, but also their families. And understanding that family looks a variety of ways for a variety of cultures. And then it provides healing and justice-centered schools, right? When we're thinking about healing and justice, we have to both be working on racial equity and racial justice, right? And when we talk about the present and the future, I often do presentations or do trainings and folks want to know, how do I get to the justice? How do I get to the justice? Well, have you set intentions for the present to get you to the future where your goals are? Are you looking at intentional and continual practice? Or are you just saying, let's check the box, right? This is a problem I can't solve, so I'm just going to push it out of the way. That's the practice we've been allowed to do versus taking back and understanding who we're working with and who we're working for. Our goal is justice so that racial disparities in health, education, employment, housing, and criminal justice are eliminated. And a person's racial identity is no longer a reliable predictor of life outcomes. I heard this quote this morning as I was preparing, and I thought it was perfect. Part of the reason we can wear the words of kindness, but have the energy of anger is because we have no justice. And folks don't know that they want justice. Folks don't know they want out of this system because for some people, it's worked really, 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 really well. And for a lot of other people, it has not. And so individually, how do we do change? How do we do things differently? What can you do from your vantage point, from your positionality to shift even how you practice, how you behave, how you role model in your spaces of influence. Restorative practice, where does this fit? Restorative justice is a response to wrongdoing that prioritizes repairing harm and recognizes that maintaining positive relationships with others is a core human need. It seeks to address the root causes of crime, even to the point of transforming unjust systems and structures. And so, as I think I saw someone put in the chat earlier, restorative practice, right? Justice, restorative justice, but then the practices that shift the culture. Shift the culture to say that young people of color deserve education. They deserve environments that affirm them, that embrace them, that don't shove them to the side because the news or last year this is what this child did, or a teacher told you, well, I had a problem with this young person all year and here you go. Those are the things that put seeds, right? Place seeds on young people that are unfair, not in service to equity, and certainly not in service to justice and healing bodies. And so with that, I think that was my last slide. Thank you. I hope I didn't rush through that too fast and that it made sense. And then I think we have some time for questions, I believe.
We do. Did not rush, but incredible content. I have all of this jotted down on the paper next to me. What hit the deepest, interrogate your biases, and the meme that you said that you had just came across this morning. If you have that readily accessible, I'd love for you to repeat that, Venus.
Yes, I can. Hold on 1 second. Part of the reason we can wear the words of kindness but have the energy of anger is because we have no justice.
Wow. So powerful. Well, I would sit here and talk to you for the next 15 minutes, but I'm not going to do that. So let's open it up. If anybody has any questions, comments, we do have a couple extra minutes here before we move on. So please feel free to either come off a chat, raise your hand, or put them in the chat.
Director Chang, it looks like we do have a question from Alexis.
I was trying to put it in the chat, but for some reason my chat wasn't able to chime in. But actually, you answered the question because it came up. That was the quote. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. Yeah, and if you'd like, Venus, if you don't mind putting that in the chat as well, I think several of us would love to kind of bookmark that in our notes.
The chat doesn't like me. I don't know why, but okay. I am also fine to to share the slides. I plan to share the slides if that is something you all would like. So
that'd be phenomenal. Shelby asked, are they sharing this information as part of teacher training in colleges?
That's a good question. I will say no. I think that if the institution or the teacher, the professor is onto it, I believe that's probably what's happening. But I don't know that it's something collectively where folks are doing it across the board. And now you just gave me something to kind of do a little research on, like what schools might be doing some of this, particularly in Pennsylvania, because that's where I am and that's what I'm most interested in right now.
Tavon asked, how can individuals work with educational systems to fix this problem?
That's the question of the year, of the decade, of the century. Tavon, to fix. I think collaborative work, right? I really do believe that, and not that higher education is the only entity that could be helpful with this, but I believe that with professors and folks that are doing research, Desiree and I are co-chairs together on a council. And so she just introduced me to the RECE program out of the University of Pittsburgh. And so one of the things I like to share with folks is, if you're not looking to see what institutions are doing around this work and how to advance it. I know I just said that educational, departments may not be doing this across the board, but there are other departments, right? Particularly Law schools are doing a number of things now with anti-racist education, how you do the law differently, how we understand how the law has scaffolded racism. So I think really talking about and having real conversations, not being afraid to say, this is our past, right? But this is our present, and we can have a different future. And I know that is very kind of philosophical and wordy, but there definitely are practical ways to do it once folks are sitting. Two of the things I talk with people about are systems design. Human systems design is a way to problem solve for social problems. And so coming up with solutions, and I think I heard earlier in our initial folks who were speaking about fitting the needs, right? Being able to serve the needs of the folks you are teaching, you are counseling, you are providing services to in any public way. And so how do you use that for solutions that fit, not solutions we think fit, right? That actually are for that community, that region, that local area. So hopefully, Tavon, that was a good response.
Fantastic. There's quite a few comments, so I'm going to go through. Another attendee, Jacqueline, asked, are there any books or websites that you recommend for parents or adults to overcome trauma? I'll say one that I know I'm very familiar with that one of my colleagues put me onto was The Body Keeps the Score. I have that. It's phenomenal, and I've heard it from many other professionals. Do you have any additional ones, Venus, that you could recommend?
I do. If anyone's heard me talk before, I always talk about Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. It really outlines a lot of more deeply, and there's some practices in it that could be helpful for individuals, but then also if you work in certain spaces. I always suggest that book, Grandmother's Hands. I also suggest any of his content on somatic abolitionism. And so really how we are talking about racism, how we're talking about oppression and getting it out of our bodies, the ways it's embedded in there. So that's another. For teachers or educators, I always like to say there's two books. One, Readings for Social Justice and Diversity, although I'm not a fan of the diversity word, but Readings for Social Justice and Diversity. And then there's Teachings for Social Justice and Diversity. So it's a kind of connected book, right? So there's two of them, but the readings help you, and then the teachings give you some practical kind of actual curriculum that you could work or tweak to use. And I've done that often, even working in public service. There's lots more, but I'll put some when I send the slides, I'll make sure to have some additional ones that I'm not thinking of right now.
That'd be great, Venus. And for, again, all of our attendees, we have the digital program. We're going to put it in again post the break that we have scheduled, but we are going to update that based on some of the discussion and content here to include some additional resources. So we will have a post-session email that is blasted, and it will contain the toolkit with some of the things that we're talking about currently. Again, still have some moments here, so we're gonna keep you if we can, Venus. Jacqueline also asked any specific books for children regarding trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yes, cannot remember off the top of my head, and I have purchased these for the young people in my life, so this is very embarrassing. But again, I will make sure you have that. Another beam.org, BEAM.org. That is another one that has some really good content around trauma, particularly connected to Black bodies, but also other bodies of color. NAMI, the National Association of Mental Illness, they're doing some really good work nationally. The Philadelphia, I'm following the Philadelphia chapter. I don't know if they call themselves chapters, so excuse me if that's wrong. And Pittsburgh, I saw some, I want to say it was with Reese, but I could be lying, so don't quote me. They had some parenting groups, and I've been thinking about, it's basically parenting while Black. And so I've been thinking about what that might look like in our area on this side of the state. And would that be something of a resource to use? But so those are some things statewide. And then there is the Penn State has their psych department, does a good number of things with development, emotional development, what's happening in schools, and how to address trauma and such there. All right, now I feel like I'm rambling.
Not at all. And then one last thing I just want to make note of that was included in the chat is that Shelby shares that Youth Courts is a restorative justice program run by youth in schools that cut down on pressing charges. So that's a resource. And she also included, it looks like their direct link into the chat for everyone. So I believe that's everything that we have. Oh, nope. And Shelby also included Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint is also a great website. So as I mentioned, we will include all of the books that were mentioned. Venus, when you share offline with us, with the committee, we'll be sure to input that and update the final toolkit to include any of those websites and books that you recommend personally. And I just wanted to circle back to one of the first questions regarding the concepts being taught in the classroom. And I know, Venus, you mentioned higher education. If you do see it, it's most commonly done so in higher ed. And our very own executive director, Lassiter, he's in the classroom at UPenn as well as Westchester University. And his two classes are specifically designed around racial concepts. One more so targeted towards social workers and how to address that issue, and then the other just racism in and throughout America and culturally. So there are professors, there are experts interested developing these criteria, curriculum, I'll say, at the higher ed level. However, it takes the expert to develop it, but more so it takes the institution to be willing to incorporate it and implement it within their options of classes. And we know that that's not the case throughout all of the institutions available nationwide, or even just throughout the Commonwealth. We have to be able to have the powers that be, so to speak, be willing to put that on a class roster to be able to educate the students at even just the higher ed level. And we know for certain K through 12, these topics are not being touched upon.
And if I could just share before we move forward, is that I also like to share with folks the generations. We have 5 generations right now in any space, and how everybody came to this or understands this is very different. So we're even having some of that tension. I believe very strongly that boomers are in a perpetual state of activation in their nervous system, because a lot of what's happening around us, there were younger bodies and that was happening, just it looks different, right? It's the same energy, it's the same philosophy. And so if we think about that, people are surviving, and they're surviving the ways that they've known to survive. And if pushing a young Black kid aside and not looking at, wait a minute, this behavior has shifted, they haven't behaved this way before, right? And you're just like, just obey. How are you, right? How are you making space for this is different, and making space for human behavior? Human behavior is slow. Human behavior is not, right? You have to watch it. You have to observe it. But the teachers and the administrators are bogged down with so much. Time is often an issue. So wherever that lands, I'll be quiet now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Venus. This was, I knew it was going to be incredible and impressive and all the things, but you, of course, never disappoint. And the chat is reflective of that. It was just a phenomenal way to set the foundation for the other speakers that we have. We are a few moments ahead of schedule. Tavon, I'll ask, if you're ready and willing to start a few minutes early, then we can go ahead and transition to you.
Absolutely. Just double check it. You can hear me and see me all right?
We can hear you, we can see you. So I'm going to turn it back to my co-moderator here, Greg Holtz, who's going to do your formal introduction.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I do want to say thank you to Ms. Ricks for that powerful presentation. And that video was something, because if I didn't see myself in that video, I saw someone else I knew. And so I'm glad that you had that video. I'm glad we had this discussion. I'm excited for not only what we just talked about, but what we're about to talk about. But I don't want to have any further delay for our next speaker. Our next speaker is a father, a husband, a community activist, a published author, professional motivational speaker, and businessman out of York, PA. After losing his brother to gun violence in February 2020, Tavon went on that same year to form his nonprofit called the Advantage Program. And through this, he empowers youth, provides mentorship exposure, and works to sustain life plans that overall will contribute to changing the narrative. Mr. Parker facilitates workshops across the schools in the United States where he teaches students how to take control of their own destiny at a young age without having to go down a negative path. Please help me welcome Mr. Tavon Parker. Mr. Parker, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Greg. I definitely appreciate that. I was sitting here listening, and I'm like, man, he's talking about me. So I definitely appreciate it. I wish I would have knew that the setup was to have me go after Venus. I do know her. She and my wife are sorors, so I do know her. So amazing presentation, Venus. And thank you guys, obviously, for allowing me this opportunity just to share a little bit about the school to prison pipeline, about some of the things that we do with the Advantage program, and more importantly, about how we can try to change the narrative and get to the other side of what I call a rec system. And the reason I call it that, before I jump in, I'll give you guys I like to kind of give the frame before I begin to paint the picture. So I don't have a bunch of slides or whatnot. I have some information. So occasionally I may ask some questions. You guys can feel free to jump in the chat. We'll have time for questions at the end, but I like it to be more of a dialogue. I don't like feeling like I'm talking at people. So with that said, as Greg said, I'm born and raised in York, Pennsylvania, and I remember at a very young age, the first vivid childhood memory I had was when I was 6 years old and my parents were divorced. And growing up, obviously York is 5 square miles, very small city, but growing up with one parent on one side of town and the other parent on the other side of town kind of felt like my mom lived in California, my dad lived in Pennsylvania. And what I very quickly started to learn and realize was a lot of the things that I experienced, a lot of people around me experienced as well. And that's what we call environment, right? The environment that we grow up in shapes us and shifts us and molds us. And what I quickly learned growing up was the things that are put on our plate. So for me being a young Black man in the inner city of York, the only thing that was really pushed to me was sports, right? Basketball and football. My mom told me that if I wanted to go to college, I had to make sure that I got a scholarship. And I worked very, very hard to be able to get a athletic scholarship to go to Millersville University. And then quickly going to a predominantly white institution, I very quickly realized that there were certain things that I just wasn't taught. There were certain lessons that were given to me that I didn't pick up. And even now, I tell kids all the time that we can give you tools to put in your toolbox, but if you bring a hammer to a situation that you need a screwdriver for, you're using the wrong tool. So it's not only about what tools you have, the other part of it is knowing which tool to use and when. So when I say that I didn't have the proper tools, the proper perspective when I got to college, I couldn't tell you where the library was. I didn't have proper study skills. I didn't have proper study habits. Time management was a lack. And to be completely honest with you guys, when I got to college, my major was basketball. But the only thing I quickly learned was they didn't offer basketball as a major. So I ended up really struggling with my grades and ended up losing my scholarship 2 short years in. And that's when my life kind of crumbled and I didn't know what to do, right? Like they always say, have a plan B, have a plan B. And my plan B was a better version of my plan A. And when I lost that plan A, I came back to my city, started selling drugs, started doing exactly what everybody else in my environment was doing, exactly what we were shown to do. And I quickly found myself incarcerated. And being in prison is where that paradigm shift happened for me, because obviously my girlfriend at the time and my daughter were left without me. There was a lot of things that the goals that I had that now I could not fulfill. So when we start looking at this school to prison pipeline, we quickly realize that the environment that people are put into plays a role in your actual success. Because when that paradigm shift happened and I realized like this isn't what I want for my life, and I began to put a plan in place and follow that plan, all of a sudden I started to see different results, being no longer going to jail. Right. That was my biggest thing. I'm like, I do not want to go back to jail. I don't know how people, like some people go back and forth to jail. After I would say about my second day in jail, I learned my lesson and told the guard I was ready to go home. But jail doesn't work like that either. Right. So I did 14 months. And when I was released back to society, I had an entrepreneurial spirit, but I quickly realized that I was just selling the wrong product. So I relaunched my lawn care business. And I was released in 2018. And when I relaunched my lawn care business, I was starting to figure things out. And I quickly realized that there has to be more to this thing called life than money, right? Because again, I'm trying to be as transparent as I can with you guys. My wife told me like, hey, if you want to sell drugs, me and my daughter are out. And I said, I don't want you guys to leave. I don't want to go back to jail. So I tried to get a factory job. And this is where the dialogue starts happening, right? Because what I've learned is in school, we're not actually educated to be thinkers, we're educated to be followers, right? So when we look at the school to prison pipeline, we realize that the school system isn't promoting free thinking. They're trying to get you to think a certain way. They're trying to get you to follow certain things and certain rules. And if for you guys that have jobs are very similar, right? So what I realized is in school, I would get in trouble for talking too much or having a rebellious spirit, because once I'm done my work, what's next? Right? I'm very, very assignment oriented. And if I complete a task, then what comes after that? Well, in the work field, what happens when you finish a task, I struggled with a factory job, right? I got out of jail and I worked a factory job, and I quickly realized the first factory job, it wasn't cutting it for me. So I went to another factory. It took me 3 factory jobs of unsuccess to realize, you know what, it can't be the job, it gotta be me. And that's where I really tapped into my purpose and realized that, hey, I'm an entrepreneur. That's why I don't like when people tell me what to do. And I started my own lawn care business. And 2 years after I started that business was when my brother was shot and killed. And obviously that was a very traumatic experience, losing somebody that you spent so much time with, somebody that you cared about, somebody that you had a relationship with. So when my brother was shot and killed, that's what inspired what we call the Advantage Program. And the Advantage Program is a nonprofit that I founded, and the goal of the program is exposure. I feel like exposure can really save some people's lives, because the one conversation that really stuck out to me from me and my brothers talking was when he said my mom would pay for me and my older brother to go to AAU basketball camps and go to different camps and whatnot, so coaches could see us, other players could see us, where his mom didn't do that. So that's what I call exposure, because sometimes you have to be in different environments around different people, get new ways of thinking and ideals in order to implement them into your life, compared to being around the same old thing all the time. So when we start exposing these young minds in the Advantage Program to all the world has to offer, we start seeing that their goals and their dreams and their aspirations begin to grow. And we expose them to, at least once a month, we go outside of York. And I vividly remember, and I do apologize, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with York, but I vividly remember one time we were going to Lancaster for a basketball game, Millersville's basketball game, actually. And as we're crossing the bridge, a kid goes, "Wow, I wonder what ocean that is." And I'm looking like, I don't think that's an ocean, right? I'm pretty sure it connects to some type of body of water, but the exposure showed me like, wow, everybody doesn't just cross this bridge, a 20-minute drive to go to a college, right? So I really started realizing very quickly that everybody doesn't have the same access, right? Everybody doesn't have the same opportunities. And I'll take a quick pause. I seen a hand raised. Desiree, should I answer the question? Did somebody accidentally do that?
Yeah, I'm not seeing the hand raised at
Okay.
the moment, but if you want to continue on, we'll absolutely give an opportunity when you conclude.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I started realizing very quickly that everybody doesn't have the same resources. Everybody doesn't have the same access and opportunities that are readily available for others. So on top of the exposure piece, we also offer the mentorship, where that's the big brother, somebody that supports you, whether you make a bad decision or a good decision. Right. Because I'm pretty sure some of us know people that when you make a good decision, people are in your corner, people are helping, people are supportive. But the second that you do something wrong, a lot of those people leave. So I very quickly learned that. And then the other piece is the sustainable plan. And it's a post-secondary sustainable plan. Because again, when I was growing up, and granted, I'm only 28, guys, but a lot of these kids now are telling me how old I am, and I graduated so long ago. So I don't want to age shame anybody, but when I was growing up, it was college, right? College. And now the realization is you can be successful in a lot of different ways. So when we say the post-secondary sustainable plan, we try to help these kids create a plan for after high school. And that could be college, that could be a trade school, that could be the military, that could be an entrepreneur joining the workforce. But if it's not one of those 5, you're probably going to end up in jail, because you have to figure out how to sustain yourself in this thing we call life. So that's the little bit of background about myself, and as well as a quick overview of the Advantage Program. But as we start looking at this school to prison pipeline and some of the practices that are in place, some of the things that school systems do to affect the way that the kids view school, and the similarities between the schools and the actual prisons, we start to realize that at a disproportionate rate, Black students are targeted more than their peers. And when I say that, the data shows that there's a zero tolerance discipline for Black students facing harsher punishments than their white students in public schools. Meaning, if a Black student gets in trouble, they're more likely to be suspended or face a harsher punishment compared to their white counterparts. Then we start questioning, we start looking. I'm one of those people I like to ask why. Right? Why is that? Why is that? Why when a white kid gets in trouble, do they get detention or a warning, but when a Black kid gets in trouble, they get in-school suspension or possibly suspended? And what I started realizing working with different schools is everybody doesn't have what we call an advocate. And when I say an advocate, we can compare it to you getting a speeding ticket and you going to court to fight for yourself. You going to court with a public defender, or you going to court for paid lawyer. It's really the same thing. If a student gets in trouble and their parent comes up to the school, talks to the principal, talks to the teachers, figure out what's going on, the school is more lenient on that student. Well, when we start looking, we realize that the Black students don't have that advocate, right? Especially when we're looking at single parent households and we start realizing that because the parents have to work, the Black mom has to work so much, she doesn't have time to then go to the school to figure out what's going on. By the time she gets off of work, she has to go home and get ready for the next day. So when we start realizing that the white parents, and I hate to make it a race thing, but when you start looking at statistics, that's what the statistics show. We start realizing that when you do go to the school to advocate for your child, they're more likely to receive a lenient punishment compared to if it's just the child defending themselves. And I've seen it happen a multitude of times, but that's just the reality. The other thing we start realizing are what we call minor infractions. And minor infractions can be being late to school, right? Getting in trouble for talking in class. But those minor infractions begin to add up, and that changes how students are viewed in the school system. So I was one of those kids that I got in trouble often for speaking, for talking in class. So go figure, I made a career out of speaking. So what I often tell kids is everybody, I believe, is born with a gift, right? Everybody has a supernatural talent. Mine just happened to be speaking. But when you don't hone that gift, if an educator doesn't fully understand exactly what's going on or exactly how to help that student, that's when they're viewed as a detriment, right? You're talking too much compared to what are you talking about? Right, like little ways to communicate and converse with students can go a big way. But when we start looking at that pipeline, we start realizing that we're putting these students in a box. And if I was taught that if you judge a fish on how good it can climb a tree, it would never compare to a squirrel. But when we have these state standards that say you have to learn this, this, and this in a matter of time, what the biggest thing that I realize is schools don't focus on emotional intelligence. Right, because sometimes a lot of kids they're emotionally smart, but intellectually they might not be on the same level. However, just because intellectually they're not on that same level doesn't mean that they're stupid, right? It doesn't mean that they can't learn. So one thing I always challenge teachers to do is to figure out how they can reach every student and not just follow the curriculum that is given to them from the schools. So okay, we're getting started. I'm getting excited because this is a very big passion of mine. Because on top of the lawn care, on top of the nonprofit, I'm a motivational speaker, as Greg said. So I go to these schools, and what I did was I created a curriculum. When I was sitting in jail, instead of wasting my days, I was trying to make my days count. So I wrote a book called Changing the Narrative, and in that book, I'll drop my website in here, you guys, if anybody's interested. But at TP Motivate, you can get all this information. And after I wrote the book, what I did was I worked with an agency to create a school-based curriculum. And that school-based curriculum focuses on the ACEs. So ACEs is our adverse childhood experiences. And when you look at the adverse childhood experiences, they have a litany of questions. And those questions gauge the risk factors and the protective factors that each child or each individual faces, because it's for adults too. I'll do it with adults too. But there will be questions like, has this individual experienced any trauma, any traumatic experience? Has this individual experienced any violence? Right? Does this individual live in a household that makes $20,000? They look at all these different things, and from those, they start that your risk factors are gauged from those. So what I started realizing is in the inner city, the risk factors for these students are higher than than some of the other county or suburban schools. But then the interesting thing for me was when you dig a little deeper, you start realizing that just because the inner city schools have their own specific plight of problems, the other schools have their own problems as well. For example, transportation, the closeness and connectiveness to community. Like these are all questions that are on this on the ACEs, adverse childhood experience test when you're answering these questions. And very quickly I started realizing, oh, there's somebody somewhere that is judging a kid based off of this paper, and they don't even know who this person is. Right. So again, that is very similar to when you go in front of a judge and the judge has never met you before. All they have is a citation or whatever the police officer has said. Just like in school where you go in front of the principal and all they have is what the teacher has said. Right. I started realizing how similar a lot of these different systems that are in place are. And when you start looking at the adverse childhood experiences, obviously everybody goes through something. However, the things that you go through, again, environment, start to cultivate and shift the mindset into each individual person. And that mindset is actually what perpetuates you towards your success or your failure. So while there are some things that are in place in the school structurally wise, like they call them school resource officers, but it's a police officer assigned to a school that walks around with a gun and it's like the enforcer. Right. I've spoken to students, and a lot of students say they don't even understand why they need a police officer. You go to certain schools and there's metal detectors. Right. You go to certain schools. There was a saying, and one of my favorite movies was man, the name just left me. It'll come back to me. But one of my favorite movies, I believe Morgan Freeman was the principal. Oh, Lean on Me. Somebody in the chat help me out.
It's Lean on Me. You're right.
Lean on Me. Okay, Lean on Me. Come on, thank you.
It's about East Side High,
Joe Clark.
New Jersey.
Yep. Joe Clark. So that's one of my favorite movies. And he said, if you treat them like animals, that's exactly how they're going to behave. So when these kids are going to school and they're walking through metal detectors and they're walking and they see school resource officers with police officers with guns, and they start realizing like, wait, am I here to be educated or am I here for something else? And the sad reality is sometimes when those kids start thinking they're here for something else, the education is the last thing on their mind. Right. When I talk to kids and I realize, again, I'm not that old, but I start realizing, and I tell the kids all the time, like I see them on social media, and we have these kids who they wake up in the morning and they wake up late because, again, their parents have to work. Right. So they wake up late. There's a lack of structure at home. They wake up, some kids get bucked, some kids walk, but they don't have time to eat a healthy breakfast. Right. So they grab a bag of Takis. They'll go into school listening to all these rappers saying, do drugs and kill this person and F this person, and listening to this stuff. Then they get into school, woke up late, no breakfast, listening to negativity, and we expect them to sit there and learn for 8 hours. And then after that, they go home, and all of a sudden we start realizing that they go home to no structure. Some of these kids have to cook and fend for their younger siblings. Some of these kids are going home to no parents, and they come to school the next day and their homework's not done. And as educators, we start wondering why. See, what I've learned is teachers sign up to teach, they sign up to educate, but somehow they become therapists, somehow they become counselors, right? Somehow they become supplemental parents. Like it's a lot bigger than just this thing we call teaching. But again, the school to prison pipeline starts to realize that at some point we need extra resources, right? At some point we need extra help. And that's exactly what the Advantage program started bridging that gap to do, because we go to the schools to check in on the kids. We have that relationship with the schools and the parents so we can play that middleman, because I'm a firm believer that when people end up in prison, it's a lack of structure, it's a lack of support. Because a lot of times people go to prison based off of drugs and drug use or drug selling. And what the reality is, before they turn to those things, they had a very promising career or life, I should say. But what happens is at some point, life made them forget exactly what they wanted to do, and they became a victim of life. And that's why they turn to those things. And now they're in jail. And sometimes they can't figure it out. Sometimes they can. But either way, the reality is the educational system isn't what failed them, but it did perpetuate their end goal, right? It did perpetuate exactly where they ended up being. So I quickly, again, I like to do some research. I like to look at some numbers, and I realized that in Pennsylvania, the average amount spent on an inmate is $42,000. And these numbers are from about 2018, so they might have been updated by now. But when you spend $42,000 on an inmate, 42,727 to be exact, and then the amount spent per student is $15,418, you realize that that's a difference of $27,000. So if you're spending more money to incarcerate a student rather than educate a kid, where do you think that kid's going to end up at? I heard a saying before that. They said if you take a kid who grows up with both parents graduated college, this kid ends up going to college and graduating, and you take a kid who grows up in the hood, both parents are on drugs, and this kid ended up using drugs, both kids actually ended up doing exactly what they should. Right? They followed the path that was set up for them, was predestined for them. They followed exactly the path that they should. And to further this point, the system takes by third grade. I was mind blown when I learned this, because I have an 8-year-old daughter who's in second grade. She's finishing her school year Friday. Yeah, man, school year ends so early these days. But she finishes her school year on Friday, and she'll be entering the third grade next year. I couldn't fathom my 9-year-old daughter being judged by whether she can read or not. And if she can't read, that same 9-year-old daughter is being prepared for prison. See, what they say is by the third grade, if you're not on reading level, then you're probably you have a higher chance to be illiterate, and illiteracy adds to the crime rate. So when a child by the third grade can't read, what they begin to do is they start building a jail cell for that child. And once you get to enough jail cells, you have an entire jail. So the money isn't being funneled to trying to get that kid up to reading level or up to par. That money is instead saying, predestining their future and saying, this is what's going to end up with this kid, end up with this student. So the third grade, just think about that for a second, guys. The third grade, 9 and 10-year-olds that can't read, somebody somewhere is saying they're going to go to jail. Now, we all know that is far from the truth, because just because you struggle with something doesn't mean that you can't learn how to do that thing. However, once you make a decision and say, this person, it might end up here, let's start preparing for this, rather than saying this person might end up in college, let's start preparing for that, they start following that trend. That's what I mean by when I say, if a person is set up for success or a person set up for failure, whichever one they end up at, they actually follow exactly what they're supposed to do. So these numbers are very, very interesting to me. And again, we're looking at the things that happen in school, the people that are highly affected by those things that happen in school, right? Again, it's schools have to be able to discipline kids. They have to be able to tier that discipline for the exact altercation or situation that happened. So usually we have detention, we have in-school suspension, we have expulsion for extreme things. However, there are some different ways to combat this. And that was one reason why I asked the question earlier while Venus was presenting, because when I go to these schools and we do the change in the narrative workbook, and again, that's a curriculum-based workbook that focuses on the ACEs and the risk factors, what we start seeing working with these schools are the grades go up, the disciplinary referrals go down, and the attendance goes up. But we learned that you can't educate a student that's not in school, that's not present. Right. So when they say that it starts at home, that is true. That is a fact, because if the student isn't coming to school, well, how can we even educate this student? If a student is habitually late and they're missing first period every day, well, how can they be successful in first period? But when I come and work with these students, the workbook is a 6-module workbook. The first module is our childhood experiences, because I'm a firm believer that at some point in life, our job is to unlearn and relearn some of the things that were programmed in us, right? I think our parents do the best job that they can, but they can only show or teach us the things that they know. That's why it's our job to get that exposure. It's our job to, when we learn new things, implement those new things, apply those new things. So we do childhood experiences. We then go to a growth mindset and a personality test. And again, this is things that they're not teaching in school, right? But what I've learned is kids don't even know their strengths and their weaknesses. So when we take this personality test, and me, for example, I realized that I'm high energy and I'm very motivational, inspirational, enthusiastic. And then my weaknesses, well, my wife actually did tell me this. She said, but one of my weaknesses on the paper says I can be too talkative. All right, go figure. My wife tells me I talk too much. But what I've learned is I can be too talkative, I can be impulsive, and sometimes I can be disorganized. So now I carry a planner because I learned my weakness. Some of these students, man, it's like you can see the light click in their head where it's like, oh, this is why Yes, this is why when you walk down the hallway, you're trying to like hide because all these people over here, they like to talk, but they're just a different personality than you. So getting them to learn that. We do a growth mindset. We also do a where we it's a we basically do a sorry, I'm trying to figure out how I want to explain this. It's a cost benefit analysis. We can go with that. It's a cost benefit analysis where we'll create these different scenarios where somebody that goes to college and somebody that drops out of high school. What's the benefits? What's the cost? What are the end goals? And when these kids start creating their own cost benefit analysis, they'll say playing sports and not playing sports, being healthy and not being healthy, having a girlfriend or being single. That's one of the favorite ones, right? My man, they have boyfriends and girlfriends, and I always tell them, just being honest, I married my high school sweetheart, so I don't try to persuade either way, but it's getting them to take the onus on themselves. We then do a after the cost benefit analysis, we do a multiple streams of income. This generation is one of the most incredibly gifted generations that I've ever met. They have a lot of things at their disposal. And then we also do a what we call a ethics, right? Morals and ethics, where it's like a little angel on your shoulder, the little devil on your shoulder. When you're walking down the hall and someone looks at you the wrong way, which one wins? But again, trying to get them to see that you can't act off of impulse, and sometimes you do have to think things through. And I'll tie all this together in a second, but we then end with the creative goals, and we call them SMART goals, right? The kids crack me up. They say, "Does that mean I'm dumb?" But it's like, no, there's not a dumb goal, but a SMART goal is an acronym, right? Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. But what happens is, after we go through this workbook, all the things the kids learn, they start implementing, and that's why those schools start seeing those changes. So when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, I'm a firm believer that there are standards that the state sets for each school to have to meet. However, schools are allotted a specified amount of money per student. The schools that need the additional assistance actually get more funding per student. And when I learned that some of these schools are getting $15,000 per student, and you start looking to see, well, how does this funding get applied to each student? There is a reason why some of these students aren't being successful, because all the funds aren't accurately being used, right? When you can bring in additional resources to help these schools, to help these students, but the resources aren't getting used for the right things, you start realizing very quickly that this is a ongoing thing that doesn't necessarily add to the success of a student. So I'm always grateful and thankful when these schools opt to work with me, because my goal is to help the school, but it's really to help the individual student. And those are some of the services I think that we need, because again, when somebody goes to prison, right? When I went to prison, I was fortunate enough to get boot camp, and boot camp was more therapeutic based. It wasn't as punitive. And one thing that was mandated in boot camp was you had to either get your GED or you had to work. Well, I very quickly started realizing that that's what adults have to do. So when you don't focus on just one thing, but you focus on the holistic development of a student, you focus on the holistic development of an individual, they're more likely to be successful. Because again, you can't just say this person isn't going to be successful in life because they struggle with school. You can't just say this person isn't going to be successful at work because they struggle with something, right? Just because you can't use your left hand doesn't mean that you're a bad basketball player. So I started very quickly realizing that a lot of the school to prison pipeline, a lot of the problem starts, and this is the crux of the information I'm trying to provide. But when we look at it, a lot of the problem starts really opening my eyes when I realized that a lot of these students have needs that the school isn't reaching. But we have students that struggle to read, and we pass them along. We have schools where I had a kid in my program who had a 16% all mark impaired, but then he gets his report cards and he has a 60. Right. And the school says, well, if he has a 16, he'll never be able to pass this year. We want him to still have a chance. And I'm like, well, where's the accountability in that? How does a kid get to a 16%? There has to be different options. There has to be more put in place to help these students. And I'm a very firm believer for preventative rather than the aftermath, because if you can prevent something, it's easier to kind of prevent it. Sorry, I hate using double words like that. But the realization is, and there's a quote that is easier to raise strong children than to fix broken men. And when we can be up front, we can be preventative, and we can look to start implementing structures and practices into the schools that don't just focus on the education, but we start focusing on the emotional, right? We start focusing on the social. We start focusing on the things that actually holistically affect these students. All of a sudden, I think we'll start seeing a bigger change, because the reality is a lot of students actually go through a lot of things that as adults we go through and are serious. But mental health is something that has a stigma around it that's not talked about. Students sometimes don't even have the vocabulary to be able to articulate some of the things that they're going through. But at what point do we say we are going to put something in place to where we can help these students? And the reason I say that is because I work with schools all across the US, and there are schools in New York that have guidance counselors, social workers assigned to specific students, and they check in with these students about the trauma that these students have gone through. There are trauma-based practices that schools have implemented. And then you see some schools that don't, and then you look at the graduation rate, and you realize the difference in the graduation rate is because of the standards that schools have decided to implement. So I'm a firm believer that there are some things that we have to do, but the biggest thing I would say is the whole environment place, the environment piece, because obviously you have a multitude of schools, right? Private, public schools, and public schools accept everybody. But the reality is, when you look at a child and the environment that child grows up in, we have to be able to supplement that environment as educators, as school leaders, but more importantly, as community members, right? Because everybody's a stakeholder when it comes to the next generation. But if we want to prevent these kids from going to prison, right? If we want to prevent these kids from ending up incarcerated, our job is to look at these kids as a holistic person, right? Just because you struggle in school doesn't mean that you're stupid. Just because you don't know how to regulate your emotions or deal with conflict doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Right? We have to holistically begin to attack these problems and help these kids get to that next level. And in order to do that, we have to do that with ourselves first. So I'm a firm believer that not just the Advantage program, but we all play a role, we all play a part in helping the school to prison pipeline. Because again, the school does have certain structures in place that screams actually you will probably end up in prison than end up in college. Right? By third grade, if you can't read, this is your future. When you come in, you're going to come in through these metal detectors. Like there are certain practices in place. However, to combat those practices, I do believe that we can actually start to do some stuff. And I'm going to land the plane with this because I want to leave some time for questions. But I'm often reminded when I work with students, when I work with the next generation, of a story, and the story is about a man and his son. And the man worked. He worked a lot of hours. He was trying to provide, right? That's what we're taught as fathers were supposed to provide. And his son, one day, his son asked him, like, "Dad, how much do you get paid an hour?" And the dad was like, "Man, that has none of your business," right? I'm pretty sure as parents, we probably told our kids that before. Like, that has nothing to do if you don't even worry with yourself about that. And his son was very persistent. He just kept asking, like, "Dad, I want to know." So one day his dad told him, "I get paid $70 an hour." Why? And the son was like, "Oh, well, can I have $20? And the dad was like, "Okay, cool." He obliged him. He gave him $20. And then it started bothering him. He said, why do you want $20? He's only 9 years old. He don't got nothing to buy. So he went down the hall to his son's room. And as he entered the room, he seen his son counting. And he's counting 50. And he added to 20. And it was like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 70. And his dad was like, "Man, what are you doing for all that money?" And his son said, "Dad, I have $70. Can I buy an hour of your time?" See, a lot of times we get caught up on the superficial things. Like if we send our kid to school with the freshest Jordans or the best clothes or a new book bag, we get caught up on the superficial, the artificial things, not realizing that the most important thing that you can do with a person is spend time with them. Like the things that we leave in a person are more important than the things that we leave on a person. And when we start looking how we can correct this school to prison pipeline, I believe that if we start investing in these kids more than just education, but the holistic child, I believe that we'll start seeing an impact. And the thing that is the thing that I don't like when you work with children, sometimes the impact is 5 or 10 years down the road, but you never know what tree will sprout from the seeds that you plant today. Guys, thank you for your time. I do want to open it up for any questions that we might have.
Thank you so much, Tavon, and thank you for blending your lived experience with, your expertise now as an adult and in your profession. We have two questions. Greg, would you like for me to field those, or do you want to take the lead in the chat?
Oh, you can field those if you want, and then I have something I want to say after they're done, if we have time.
Absolutely. So Alexis had raised her hand. So Alexis, if you would like to come off of mute and ask your question.
Oh, yes, Tavon. So first, did I say your name right?
Tavon.
Tavon, that's right. Okay, sorry. I apologize.
No problem.
So it was, I want to say it was more of a question comment more about like cultural biases, and like what I wanted to mention was like people don't like kind of like grasp like the concept of like generational like biases that like students and like how it impacts them from like their families, and like with like education, like a lot of families don't like not just teachers and like me as a therapist, because I do like school-based therapy with like kids in the school. Like they don't understand, like a lot of parents don't highlight the importance of education. So like when teachers are like, you don't care about your education, it's not that kids they don't care about their education, is that their parents don't highlight the importance of education as well. So it's not that the kids don't care, it's like the parents are not making that a priority too. So like if a teacher's like, you don't care, you're making it more of a big deal than their parents are as well. So when you're kind of like projecting, and the kids are like, well, I care, but I don't care. So it's kind of like, you're putting a big importance. So if you're putting a big importance and their parents aren't, they kind of get like lost in the process. And also if their parents aren't as educated, you're kind of like forcing something on them that they don't really understand. So you're kind of trying to push for a change that they're not used to. So it's kind of like a generational trauma that you're kind of like change. So like teachers kind of say like, do you want to be better than your parents? A lot of parents don't want their kids to be better than them. And we get like and I know myself, coming from a minority community, like my mom was like a high school graduate at best. I have a master's degree. I was the first person in my family that graduated high school and in college and have a master's degree. So for us, that was like a huge deal. But my mom didn't say like, oh, you're doing great. Like every time we have a conversation, she's like, oh, you think like your college degree. It comes up in conversation all the time, but we're talking about Thanksgiving dinner. She's like, well, your college degree. That's like, it's never like a topic of discussion, but then it's like, all right, why are we talking about your master's in education, Alexis? I don't know, Mom. Why are we talking about like your master's in education? We're talking about turkey.
Right.
So like I think a lot of teachers don't understand that, and then like the school's trying to focus on like the wrong thing. Like I didn't eat this morning, and you're talking about ELA. I'm hungry. I don't care what's on the board. I literally woke up this morning hungry. So it's like that sort of thing, like getting kids that like change their like personal ideals from what is really necessary. Or like I live in a predominantly like white area now, and we have kids coming in from like inner city Redding and stuff, and they're like, why are these kids worried about their sneakers and all of this stuff, and like they don't have like food, like they can't read. It's like, because culturally sneakers are super important. So like if they look stupid and they look like their clothes are not like up to par, that looks culturally dumb for them. They like reading isn't like really a high priority. So like that sort of thing, like trying to separate them and get that cultural change where like, yeah, you need to know how to be educated, you need to be employable, but your parents means everything in your culture.
Thank you so much, Alexis. I think you highlighted such great points that Tavon had touched on as well, with regards to cultural competency and, some of those other traumatic experiences or just challenges with the structure of their home life. Tavon, did you have any comments back to Alexis before we move on to our Director of Fair Housing's comment?
Yeah, Alexis, thank you for that comment. I would just definitely say I agree with you. Cultural biases is a very real thing. And a lot of the school districts that I work with now, they're saying that they're seeing a rise in Haitian Creole students. In New York, they were seeing a rise in Spanish speaking students. So when it's the first step is being aware of that change. The second step is, what are we going to do to help assist this new demographic, right? Because a lot of times it's very, very, it's an ignorance on both parts. But if I don't know how to communicate with a Haitian Creole student or a Spanish student, but when they come here, their mindset is already different. But now if we can't even communicate to educate them or have a conversation with them, then how are we supposed to get through? I think it goes both ways, but the cultural thing is a real phenomenon, and I think it's very important, especially for schools, to be able to break through that barrier. Because again, the sneakers you wear might be a conversation starter, but one quote that I live by is, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And once you can get through that cultural thing, all of a sudden it's easier to begin to educate a student. So yeah, thank you for those comments.
Thank you, Tavon, for catching the chat. How you were speaking and also monitoring the chat, I have no idea, but one of our attendees had asked for that book. And so that book that he had referenced is there in the chat. And I just wanted to make note, our Director of Fair Housing did raise her hand, but she put her comments in the chat. She had said that overly strict and simplistic school structures doing disservice to the complexities and the realities of the whole child's life experience, which is pretty much exactly what you were talking about, having that holistic approach. Police officers watching for things to be wrong, yet some schools have no libraries, healthcare professionals, no counselors, and others are only part-time. Absolutely, Director Eister. And again, Tavon, I want to thank you for your input. Please, everyone else, refer to the chat. There's extensive comments in there. I want to be mindful of our union folks and giving the break that we have promised in the agenda. So I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator here, Greg, to move us to break.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Tavon Parker, for that powerful message. I agree with so much that you said, and how within your presentation, you tackled not only the school, but you tackled the ability to educate at home and how we need to have both systems in place. But right now, we're going to be taking a short 10-minute break, get some coffee, stretch your legs, do what you need to do, then come back within that 10 minutes because we have so much more in store for you. Thank you.